The rag felt like old leather against his palm and smelled faintly of coffee and shoe polish, a scent that had become part of the way he measured nights. The Steinway in the corner caught the chandelier light and held it like a memory, its varnish thin in places, the mahogany grain showing seams of history. Ethan Cole, 39, janitor at the municipal concert hall and single father, moved through the empty rows with the slow surety of someone who had made honor out of routine. He ran the cloth along the fallboard as if it were a ritual, as if each pass could keep the past from flaking off. No one among the gala guests believed the man who emptied trash bins and rolled coat racks could remember what a perfect A sounded like. Beside him, Maya, 9, traced with a stubby finger the outline of the ivory keys through the dust, humming a tuneless cadence and making small percussive taps that echoed like promises. From the raised box seats, a voice with too much lacquer and too many teeth cut through the hush. Darren Reed laughed, a sound like polished glass clinking against china, and said loud enough for half the room to parse his amusement, "You really let the janitor near the piano tonight?" That got the tidy chorus of surprise that dressage and privilege tend to practice. Ethan smiled, a small, private smile that was part apology, part memory, and kept cleaning. A woman in a structured suit, Celia Moran, holder of a foundation that funded concerts and dinners and the kinds of names that bought press, watched him for a second longer than politeness required. Her gaze was not pity, it was inventory. As the chandeliers breathed and the servers folded napkins into precise shapes, there was a soft ignition in the air, a quiet promise that something intimate might yet become public. Silence, a cloth, a laugh, and then the possibility of a truth waiting to be unfolded. When the first fork clicked against a plate, the unpleasant joke landed with neat precision. Darren leaned forward and said, "This is the charity gala, not open mic night." He smirked, and the table nearest him smirked in sympathy. Naomi Ruiz, the stage manager who kept a clipboard like a shield, glanced toward Ethan and then looked away, as if she could not be seen defending a janitor. Marcus Lee, the bartender, set a drink down with a practiced indifferent tilt and muttered under his breath, "You heard that, right?" which was a soft communal punctuation to the ridicule. Ethan felt the wind of the laugh pass his face and held his breath like someone bracing against a cold door. Maya slid her hand into his and squeezed, an anchor. Ethan answered with lightness. "Are you going to let him be the critic tonight?" she asked, as if she did not know the answer. He almost told her to draw louder, to make pictures that would drown out the laughter, but instead he said, "Keep drawing and see how many notes you can fit in a cloud." The joke ricocheted again. Celia shifted in her seat, a small clearance in her expression that might have been curiosity or might have been the tiredness of seeing the same social cues practiced in different costumes. The room smelled of olive oil, expensive perfume, and the faint iron tang of wine. A server brushed past the Steinway, and the keys gave a shy, accidental sound like a throat clearing. It was not cruelty that stung most, but the certainty that the world had filed Ethan away under a label and put a heavy lid on the part of him that owed the world music. The taunt would be a gnawing thing through the night, unless turned, unless reshaped into a note that could not be mocked. The main hall held its own narrative, and it read opulence in small details. The stage was flanked by gilt columns, each one reflecting a slightly different face of the room. Programs were printed on thick cream stock and slipped into silk envelopes. Servers moved soundlessly, like actors trained to be invisible. The lighting was deliberate, a warm gold stained into fabrics and faces. Guests moved between plates and conversation as if social currency could be exchanged with the right sentence and the right smile. When Celia Moran entered, she did so like someone who had rehearsed the effect of arriving at exactly the right tempo. Her dress whispered along the carpet, her heels clicked in a sequence that made people straighten and recalibrate. There was an audible rustle of silk and a murmur of approval. Evelyn Park, Celia's aide, followed with a tablet of talking points, her eyes darting toward Ethan and then away as if inventorying vulnerabilities and advantages simultaneously. A program for the evening was announced, trophies were named, and an acceptance speech rehearsal was practiced in corners that smelled of jasmine and candle wax. The concert hall drained into itself with a low hum of expectations. Somewhere off stage, a technician called for quiet, the word folding the room like sheet music being closed. The stakes were not only for the money being raised. Pride and reputation were being scored like movements in a concerto. The patronage Celia represented could open doors, deposit names into databases, and rewrite who gets to play on a stage that had belonged to a very small set of names for decades. The air between wealth and service was taut and glittered, like light against polished wood. Backstage, the world changed scale. There was the thump of cases being moved, a metallic tang from stage lights, and the distinct, slightly sweet smell of rosin where rehearsals had been held earlier. Ethan crouched to tune a loose pedal bolt and felt the familiar scrape of metal and the whisper of felt. Naomi came up behind him and said, soft but clear, "You should be in concert.
There with Maya after the speeches if they call you." Ethan glanced at the small notebook in her hand that had timing and names underlined. She had been the kind of stage manager who kept chaos honest. He said, "I do not even know if they would have me play. Maya does not care about that. She only cares if I hum the song right." Naomi sighed and crouched to look him in the eye. "There is a way to make them listen," she said. "We will make the moment about music, not about you being found in a broom closet." Marcus, wiping down glasses, leaned in and added, "You ever think about applying to the community recital?" Ethan asked, like an offer more than a question. Ethan's hands stilled for a moment, the bolt in his palm a small, private thing. "That was before," he began, and his voice dropped to what felt like the right register for a memory. He told them in staccato pieces about the conservatory scholarship he had once almost taken, the teacher who had said he had the touch. But the scholarship had evaporated when his father had fallen ill, and the cost to the family was a life that needed steady hands. He said, "I ended up sweeping the practice rooms then, sweeping the halls, and sometimes sitting in the dark listening to lessons through the walls." Maya, curled at his feet with her crayon and paper, drew treble clefs like flowers and did not look up. Naomi listened and then did something that surprised him. She reached across and squeezed his shoulder with a steady, human firmness and said, "You taught yourself more than most people learn in computer degrees, Ethan." There were 6 sensory impressions in the exchange if one counted the taste of coffee from the mug Naomi held, the roughness of the rag in Ethan's hand, Maya's small chalky breath, the hum of the dimmer, the sticky residue of rosin on his fingers, and the faint acetone smell of stage paint. Each of those things felt like evidence for who he was outside the script people assigned him. This backstage was where histories collided, and where a small conspiracy of kindness began to right itself. In a cup of memory, Ethan's childhood sat heavy and warm. He had grown up in a building where the elevator often smelled like hot summer milk, and the hallway lights flickered like hesitant punctuation. His mother had been a copy typist who loved to whistle while she worked, and his father had been a mechanic who humored a young boy who liked to strike piano keys in the mall piano at the end of the street. The first time a teacher noticed him, he was 8, and had improvised a piece that made the school principal stop mid-step. There had been a scholarship letter and a picture of Ethan in a stiff suit smiling with his front teeth that were not yet grown.
Then came the afternoon his father collapsed in a garage that smelled of oil and old newspapers, and the scholarship became a choice between staying in music and keeping a roof over the family. Ethan chose the roof. He learned to patch radiators and fix boots, and he learned something else. He learned how sound could be a refuge you carried in your bones. He spent a decade inside conservatory corridors as a cleaner, listening through doors to master classes, committing phrases to memory, learning how a diminuendo could make people lean forward, how a silence could be an entire sentence. He married, briefly, or thought he had, and that marriage dissolved as quietly as a note fading. His daughter came after, smiling and midnight bright, and he became the parent who patched scraped knees and read sheet music with a lamp under the blanket. He kept his scores in a cardboard box under the mattress. Sometimes he thought of the brilliance of a life that might have been, but more often he thought of measures as methods for keeping time with Maya. That compressed narrative of childhood, apprenticeship, loss, and present sustenance filled roughly 9 paragraphs of his inner monologue that had room for ache, for the smell of his father's grease, for the bright hope of scholarship envelopes, and for the daily domestic music of being a parent. It explained why a man in a janitor smock could press his fingers to keys and make a room forget its script for a moment. The public taunt sharpened into a louder provocation as the program edged toward entertainment. Darren leaned forward, his silver cufflinks catching light like punctuation, and called across the table, "Would you please, someone, ask the janitor to serenade us before dessert? I think the philanthropist in the room would like a laugh. Or would he like a free concert?" And that was a challenge thrown like a glove. The room inhaled, new laughter cued like echoes that knew their cue. Celia caught the comment and watched as the smugness bloomed on Darren's face. She felt something akin to discomfort, but masked it with a smile that contained both amusement and calculation. Naomi met Ethan's eyes with a quick, conspiratorial nod and mouthed, "It is your call." Ethan's palms were warm from the cloth and slightly grimy at the edges. He stood at the threshold between dignity and spectacle and felt the magnetic pull of 2 opposing forces. Maya squeezed his hand and said softly, "Play me the lullaby, Dad." And in that small plea he heard not the world but the little room they shared, the nightlight, the comic books turned into staging for bedtime, the ritual that had kept them both anchored. He wanted to refuse for fear of humiliation, but he also wanted to show Maya that talent does not always wait for permission. Darren saw the hesitation as a victory and raised his glass in an invitation that smelled faintly of hubris. Ethan glanced at Celia as if seeking a tacit note in a score. She smiled with a civility that could be read as grant or guillotine, and said in a voice that was even and measured, "Fine. Let the man play and see what happens." That sentence shifted the air and raised the stakes. The moment was now not only about a man and his child, but about what the room would do when confronted with a talent that did not fit their expectations. It became a test, and tests are where character either breaks or reveals itself. The backstage decision became a nervous sequence of preparations. Naomi straightened the bench with a hand that examined the wear on its legs and said, "Sit square." Marcus fetched a damp cloth and polished the fallboard until the varnish caught and threw splinters of light across Maya's drawing. Celia did not move from her box seat, but Evelyn leaned forward and whispered something to her about programming and image. Security shifted in small, observant ways. Andre Brooks, the head of house security, and a man used to reading worry like a second language, stood by the curtains and called softly, "Can we keep the passage clear? Please be mindful of timing." He was as much a metronome as the stage lights. The staff murmured a chorus of practical instructions, a litany of cues and contingencies. Ethan sat down at the Steinway and felt the keys cool under his palms. He breathed in the smell of wood and rubato. The audience fell into an expectant murmur. Naomi touched his shoulder just once and then ducked into the wings. He placed his hands and lifted them, feeling the small hairs stand on his forearms as if they were little antennae picking up the room's signal. He thought of his father and the smell of motor oil, of the scholarship letter, of the cardboard box under the mattress, of Maya's small hand. He thought about silence and what it had cost him. He thought about moments like this being rare and sacred, and decided to answer the provocation with music rather than with anger. That choice was a small act of generosity in a room that had not been generous to him. When Ethan began to play, the first sound was not the kind of confident blast that steals breath. It was a modest, tentative note, the way a question opens a sentence. The sound cut through the crystal chatter of the room, and those close to the stage turned their heads. The first bar was a memory made audible, a melody that moved like a river remembering its course. He played in a manner that pulled silence into its own part of the texture,
letting the audience fill with expectation and then refusing it, like a teacher withholding the full answer until the class leaned in. The piano breathed with varnish and age. The notes had a certain grain, a tiny hiss in
the sustain that made them feel human. There were 7 distinct sensory impressions in that passage alone: the coolness of the ivory, the mellow grit of the lower octaves, the warm resonance in the ribs of the board, the faint sweetness of perfumed air from the boxes, the metallic bright shimmer when he hit high notes, the dry dust motes that floated in the gold beam, and the feeling of his own heartbeat under his fingernails. The melody built like architecture, each phrase an arch, each cadence a column, until the music sounded less like a demonstration than a conversation. People who had come expecting comic relief found something else. A woman in the front row wiped her brow as if surprised by a long-withheld memory. Darren's smile thinned, as if a scalpel removed a false layer of him. Celia's pupils dilated slightly, and for the first time in the evening, her face removed the polite mask and became honest. The composition he had chosen folded in fragments of lullaby, a motif Maya recognized and hummed without realizing, and a phrase that echoed a teacher's reprimand from a conservatory corridor long ago. The performance kept shifting and bending, building tension and then releasing it in a way that felt like confession rather than showmanship. Dialogues erupted around the performance in a way that was not scripted. After the first movement, Naomi whispered to Marcus, "Did you expect that?" "No," he replied, and their exchange contained 8 little conversational beats as they parsed surprise and recalibrated assumptions. At Ethan's bench, a man from the audience, Dr. Harold Voss, leaned forward and said, "Sir, that was extraordinary." And Ethan bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said, and the man added, "Please tell me where you learned to play." "Surreptitiously through work," Ethan said, and the man offered a business card as if bridging a gap. Celia rose from her seat and walked down the aisle with a purpose that turned heads. Near the back table, Sophia Grant, a public school music teacher who had come with a class to offer tuition receipts, stood up and started to cry quietly into her napkin. That small cascade of public response changed the temperature of the room. People found themselves applauding first with polite hands and then with something deeper, the sound growing into genuine applause that surprised even the servers. Ethan finished, and for a breath, the world was very still. Silence. A held note. Then the room dissolved into applause that was not only polite, but also corrective. It corrected an evening that had presumed to rank people by station and reminded it that art can reassign value in explosive, tender ways. The immediate aftermath rearranged relationships. Darren, who had expected to be the center of tonight's narration, stood without words that could fit the new framing. His face moved through stages of dismissal, recalibration, and finally a thin, mechanical clap that did not reach his eyes. Celia reached him first and put a hand at his elbow with a disarming directness. "You were wrong," she said simply, which was a small, simple sentence that contained a recalibration of power. Naomi helped Ethan from the bench and wrapped a towel of courtesy around his shoulders as if to guard him from a world that might still try to exploit the miracle. Marcus offered a bottle of water and said, "Keep it, man," as a human anchor. Andre, the security chief, came closer and said, "You played like a man who had something to say," and that line landed like a benediction. A local critic at the far table, Evelyn Park, who often wrote incisive pieces that could make or unmake reputations, began to type notes fast, and then stopped and looked up, plainly moved. Celia took Ethan aside where the scent of backstage smelled of cleaning solutions and honeyed smoke from empty bulbs, and said, "I would like to talk about bringing you into a program." Her offer was practical and powerful at once. It promised rehearsal slots, an introduction to patrons, a modest stipend that would allow him to teach community classes, and a chance to be recognized without spectacle. Ethan could have refused on principle, fearing the strings tied to charity, but he saw Maya watching from the wing and recognized the opportunity to build something more than a single evening. He accepted after a pause that allowed both of them to breathe. The negotiation that followed required careful language. Celia explained the program in terms that were concrete. "We will provide weekly rehearsal time at the conservatory," she said, "with a donation processed through the Moran Foundation to cover instructor fees and room rental. There will be a 3-month pilot with quarterly reporting and an open recital at the end of the pilot. We can also connect you with Sophia Grant to help build a curriculum for kids." Ethan asked about compensation and whether there would be a formal contract, and Celia nodded. "Yes, there will be a formal grant letter with terms for stipend distribution and liability coverage." The process description included specifics about how the foundation expected measurement of outcomes: enrollment numbers, participant feedback, and attendance metrics for recitals and community outreach. A staff lawyer would draft the agreement through the foundation's typical channels, and a liaison would be assigned to help with scheduling and publicity. This technical description was not a gloss. It mattered because it showed that the offer was not a one-night miracle, but a potential structure for sustainable change. The contract would require signatures, bank details for stipend deposits, and a simple memorandum of understanding about use of the conservatory spaces. Celia said, "She wants to do this to be effective, not performative," and she meant it. The exchange revealed that real philanthropy needs both heart and paperwork to survive, and Ethan felt a strange relief at the mixture of compassion and clauses. There were ripples beyond the gala. A local newsfeed picked up the story and wrote a piece with a headline that made people click, then think. The article quoted Darren's earlier joke and juxtaposed it with Celia's quiet rescue, and it included an image of Ethan and Maya holding hands. Calls came into the foundation from parents who had been moved, emails from students who wanted to enroll, and a message left on the Steinway's manufacturer page from a man who remembered his own lost chance. Sophia Grant organized an after-school program and began drafting a curriculum for beginners and for adults who had left music behind. Naomi coordinated initial rehearsal time. Marcus offered to raffle off a private tasting evening from his contacts to raise money for scholarships. Evelyn Park, the critic, wrote a column reframing the story as a social mirror that reflected how talent often hides in ordinary places. This social reaction created momentum and began the arc from a single, surprising performance to an organized attempt at systemic change. There were, naturally, tensions to explore and to sit with. One moment was the question of agency and whether Ethan felt tokenized by the spotlight. He told Naomi late one night, "I do not want to be a project. I want to be a musician and a father and a person." Naomi said, "Then we will build something that respects you." That exchange was a small but crucial negotiation about dignity. Another tension arrived when Darren published a tepid op-ed suggesting that the gala had been manipulated for PR value. His piece implied that Celia had staged the moment to appear magnanimous. That claim landed with a blade and forced Celia to prove the authenticity of her offer through transparent funding documents and an open application process for the program. The third tension was logistical. Some of the conservatory faculty questioned whether someone without formal degrees could teach at their institution. Sophia advocated fiercely. "You teach what you have lived," she said, and slowly won support for a model that paired Ethan with credentialed teachers so that pedagogy met experience. Each of these tensions was explored in slower paragraphs that allowed memory, internal hesitation, and the negotiation of identity to breathe. Those passages were longer and more contemplative, delving into what it means to accept help and how to turn a moment of charity into something that lasts. About a month later, the program began. The first meeting took place in a modest classroom that smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. Maya sat in the front row, drawing clefs and looking very much like a small official. 8 students showed up the first week, a mix of kids who had never touched a key and one retired veteran who liked rhythmic patterns. Ethan set up the benches and tuned the donated upright until it sang as if grateful. The first month was a period of building trust. There were moments when parents arrived late or forgot materials, when funding paperwork delayed stipends, and when Ethan had to balance janitorial shifts with scheduled rehearsals. But there were also breakthroughs. A shy boy named Carlos, who had come after a flyer placed in a laundromat, managed to play 2 measures from memory, and his mother clapped as if small and public victory had returned. Sophia recorded attendance and feedback and marveled at the steady incline. Naomi negotiated additional time at the conservatory to accommodate weekend sessions. Celia visited the classroom and sat quietly in the last row, watching without interference, and left after speaking with Ethan alone about long-term goals. That first month revealed the kind of work that moves slowly and shows its impact in small increments. The program felt less like a headline and more like a garden being planted. 3 months in, the pilot had grown into something more defined. Enrollment had tripled, and the community recital at the end of the quarter filled a small local theater. Parents lined the aisles, and the retired veteran who had been skeptical at first performed a piece that made entire families stand up like they had been present at a small miracle. The foundation issued its first report with attendance metrics and participant narratives. They tracked improvements in confidence, social engagement, and musical skill in percentiles and also in the intangible things numbers cannot fully hold. The nods exchanged between strangers, the way a child's posture straightened under applause. Sophia and Ethan co-designed a curriculum that alternated technique with storytelling, allowing students to pair scales with personal memories. Marcus coordinated a fundraiser that paid for sheet music and new keys for a teacher piano. Darren had a quiet, private moment on the edges of a performance where he watched and then, unexpectedly, approached Ethan to ask about where he had learned the lullaby he played the first night. The conversation between them was awkward at first and then human, a small reconciliation that did not erase past disdain but made space for recognition. At 3 months, the work felt like a small organism that breathes and struggles, but lives. 6 months later, the program had created a small but stable ecosystem. The foundation extended funding for another year and registered the initiative as a community outreach program with a simple official name that did not attempt to brand the people it served. Enrollment stabilized at a number that allowed for weekly classes, some private lessons, and a monthly open mic where families came not to be judged but to be heard. Ethan had reduced janitorial hours and increased teaching time. He had a modest stipend that paid utility bills and bought Maya a better pair of shoes. The conservatory offered him an honorary teaching assistant role that gave him access to sheet music databases and a community of teachers who respected him for what he did and who he was. The local paper ran a feature that told the arc from a joke in a gala to a miracle.
Living program that taught music across generations. The story had spread to a regional radio station that interviewed Mason, the veteran, on air about rhythm as therapy. The program began to attract donations, small and large, practical as well as performative. And the foundation developed a simple, transparent dashboard with enrollment numbers and financials that allowed donors to see exactly where money went. At 6 months, the change felt less miraculous and more durable. People said that the gift had been twofold: music and dignity. In the small domestic archive of his apartment, Ethan kept the cloth that had started conversations that night. He kept it in a drawer with a few scores and his father's handwritten notes. Sometimes, at night, he would open the drawer and feel the smooth of its surface and remember the smell of coffee and shoe polish. Maya slept with a recording of him playing that first performance and sometimes asked to hear the part where the audience forgot to breathe. In a quiet moment in the kitchen, Celia called and asked if Ethan would be willing to host a masterclass as part of a town hall series the foundation was planning. He said yes. Naomi arranged for additional stools at the venue. Marcus organized a reception, and Evelyn agreed to moderate a panel about access to the arts. The epilogue was not a victory lap, but a continued sequence of small practicalities and small joys. 1 month snapshot. The class had 8 students and 1 veteran who tapped rhythms on his knee. Ethan balanced his janitorial shifts with teaching and spent a Saturday afternoon buying sheet music with the stipend. Sophia created a simple curriculum, and Marcus held a small fundraiser. Celia visited once and walked the room quietly. A local parent named Ingrid wrote an email thanking the foundation for a chance to have her child participate. The program was fragile but alive. 3-month snapshot. Enrollment tripled, and the community recital filled the small theater. The retired veteran Richard played a full piece that moved families to stand. The foundation published a report with metrics and narratives, and Darren privately expressed curiosity about the lullaby. Ethan began receiving modest honoraria for private lessons, and the conservatory offered supervised rehearsal space. 6-month snapshot. The program earned a modest extension, and the foundation established a small dashboard for transparency. Ethan reduced janitorial hours and increased teaching hours. The open mic became a monthly event, and the program started to attract donations from local businesses that offered practical support, instruments, sheet music, tutoring. Maya took part in a student showcase and grinned in a way that made Ethan feel the history of his choices converge. Each time he cleaned a practice room now, he also brought small notes from students to be read aloud in staff meetings. The change had the texture of patient, incremental work. Throughout the arc, there were technical procedures that had to be scrupulous and credible. Grant processing required a standard application, a one-page proposal, an attached budget spreadsheet, and references from 2 community partners. The foundation required quarterly reporting that included participant rosters, attendance sheets, and brief narrative accounts of progress, as well as a financial breakdown. Contracts were drafted to include stipend schedules, deliverables, and basic liability clauses regarding venue use. Enrollment paperwork collected basic demographic information, emergency contacts, and a simple consent for photography and recording limited to promotional use. Payment flows were established through direct deposit, with simple invoices and receipts kept in a shared folder. These technical steps were not dramatic, but they were essential. They made the charity real and kept it accountable. They ensured that music did not remain a one-night spectacle, but became practice over time. In quieter moments, Ethan worried about something he could not quite name: tokenism, or maybe the fear of losing the raw sincerity that had made him play that night. He spoke to Naomi about the worry, and she counseled, "Keep your boundaries, protect your students, and let the paperwork do what it does." A friend named Marcus joked, "You should charge them more for that lullaby," and laughed, but there was seriousness under the humor. Sophia reminded him that teaching is as much about shaping confidence as about shaping technique. Each of these voices became part of the chorus that sustained the program. Darren, in a smaller arc of his own, began to volunteer at a local shelter and found in quieter encounters with people an erosion of the sharpness that had once made him a champion of snark. He apologized to Ethan in an awkward email, and then in a short conversation at a rehearsal where he said, "I misread you that night." And Ethan nodded, "I played because my daughter needed to see that what she sees in me is real." Celia continued to fund and to ask difficult questions, as any responsible patron must. The program kept its humility and its practical paperwork. The final scenes returned to an intimate image. Ethan sat at the Steinway after a rehearsal and watched Maya run her fingers along the keys as if each key were a stair in a house they were building. He took the rag from his pocket and handed it to her as if passing on a relic, and she laughed and wiped a small smudge from the piano with exaggerated care. She said, "Do not worry, Dad, I will keep it shiny." And he smiled and said, "You already do." The story closed not on a single triumph, but on the quiet persistence of the work. If you felt your chest tighten at the joke that landed in that first act, or if you remembered a time you watched someone be underestimated, we want to hear from you. Start your comment with "I witnessed" or "when I," and tell us a short sentence about the time you saw someone surprising us. Your words help shape what stories we seek next and remind others they are seen. If these stories matter to you, subscribe to stay with us as we follow this program and others like it. Subscribe and be part of a community that believes in second chances and in transforming silence into music. Your subscription helps us continue to find hidden voices and to follow projects that turn a single moment of recognition into lasting change. Thank you for listening and for caring enough to keep watching stories that ask us to look again.